What's going on, ladies and gentlemen? My name is Michael and welcome to FudgeMuppet. Today I felt like making a neat discussion video regarding a piece of Elder Scrolls lore you may have heard about while playing Elder Scrolls V Skyrim. What I'm talking about is the Accession War, also known as the time the Argonians absolutely slaughtered thousands of Dark Elves. It's talked about by Adril Arano, the second Counselor of Ravenrock, who you meet in the Dragonborn DLC, and it's written about in a book you can find in many places called Rising Threat Volume 4. The commonly accepted belief is that the Argonians invaded the Dark Elves due to centuries of slavery the Dark Elves inflicted upon them. At first glance, it certainly seems like the Argonians are in the right here. I mean, the Dark Elves definitely can't expect the Argonians to like them after forcibly enslaving their race, can they? But upon further investigation and consideration, I've started to reconsider if what the Argonians did really is justified. Sure, I don't blame the Argonians for feeling how they felt, but perhaps their actions will prove that two wrongs don't make a right. While morality doesn't have black and white answers, I want to use this video to more or less explain what the Argonians did to the Dark Elves, and give you a lot more details that you may not know about or may not have considered, which at least to me show the events in a whole new light. So first I'll explain what happened and the background information of what led up to it, then we'll talk about if the Dark Elves truly deserved what they were given. Also, after you've listened to the whole video, I'd love to hear what you think in the comments below, as I always love to read different perspectives on what people think of events in the Elder Scrolls universe, and that's what this is really, another perspective I've been thinking about, food for thought if you will. Also, if you want more videos like this, let me know, and feel free to share any topic ideas that you might have. So for centuries upon centuries throughout multiple eras, Dark Elves have employed slavery as a tool to help their society flourish. The Argonians, hailing from Blackmarsh, which shares its north border with the south of Morrowind, have been a prime target for such slavery. The Dunmer Great House Dress is a main offender here, with both their territory in Morrowind being the most southernmost, and their customs and attitudes being highly pro-slavery. Slavery is practiced all throughout Morrowind, of course, but House Dress have relentlessly performed raids and often bring back entire Argonian tribes in chains. In fact, House Dress was actually established formally after a slave raid conducted in the northeastern Argonian city of Thorn, so they have slavery at their very foundation. They don't do this to be cruel, however, they do it for utility. House Dress is an agricultural society possessing massive salt rice plantations that, simply put, rely on slavery to be economically viable. This obviously does not make it okay though. House Telvanni are also another great house who staunchly defend and use slavery. They see it as an ancient Dunmer right and have their holdings worked by slaves. Anyway, so Dark Elves have always enslaved other races, Argonians included, and Argonians have always hated the Dunmer for it. In fact, there have been multiple battles because of it, one of them being the Arnesian War of the Third Era in the year 396. Small conflicts between Argonians and Dark Elves were festering for years before this occurred, and it all started during a slave revolt. During the revolt, a follower of the tribunal named Aurorus was captured by Argonian abolitionists and tortured intensely. The Argonians demanded he renounce the tribunal until his death. This single act resulted in a formal declaration of war, and in the long run this saw large portions of northern Blackmarsh become assimilated and put under the control of Morrowind. It is said that vengeance and justice for the martyred Saint Rorus was the rallying cry of the Arnesian War, though to me it really sounds like the Dark Elves just used this one outbreak as an excuse to launch an attack on Blackmarsh territory and exploit the Argonians even further. I mean, their armies attacked just because of the actions that occurred in one single slave revolt. It's a pretty lame excuse that would have seen many innocent Argonians killed just because of what a few rebels did. But why would the Dark Elves care? They're already invading the borders for slaves anyway. Now there's a lot more interactions and events to take into account, which I'll go through in this video, but first let's talk about what the Argonians did to gain revenge against the Dark Elves, starting with their performance in the Oblivion Crisis, and then talking about what the Accession War was. So as those of you who played Oblivion would know very well, Mehrunes Dagon invaded Tamriel in the year 433, attempting to bring widespread destruction to all of its inhabitants. Oblivion gates popped up all around the continent, and this caused a massive amount of trouble for the Empire as their grip over various provinces slipped and the political fate of Tamriel was forever altered. Now the Argonians, while they've been trodden on for most of history, actually performed pretty well during the crisis. You see, the Hist trees laying deep in Blackmarsh foresaw the coming of Mehrunes Dagon and telepathically communicated communicated with the Argonians, telling them to come back to their homeland. The Hist then used their powers to enhance the Argonians, giving them vastly increased strength, agility, and resistances, allowing them to endure terrible things. This made them fearless, and when the Oblivion crisis came, a radical nationalistic group known as the Anzalil then helped rally the Argonians, who proceeded to fight off the Daedra. They even went into the Oblivion gates to keep fighting the Daedric invaders, slaughtering them and forcing them to close their own portals. This brought the Anzalil faction to great prominence, and the victorious Argonians emerged more nationalistic than ever before. Blackmarsh seceded from the Empire, and then 6 years into the Fourth Era, they decided to mount a full-blown invasion of Morrowind, taking advantage of the eruption of Red Mountain, which occurred just recently in the 5th year. So the Dark Elves had to deal with the problems of the Oblivion crisis, and then as they're recovering from that, Red Mountain erupts, covering Morrowind with smoke and toxic ash, causing widespread death, panic, and destruction. And then, after all of this, the Argonians come on in. Again, it was the Anzalil who were largely responsible for rallying this attack, and it's suggested that the Thalmor also played a part in encouraging them to do so. And so the Accession War went down. Argonians invaded Morrowind, even sacking the capital city of Mournhold and annihilating all Dark Elves in their way. They captured a large chunk of the southern half of Morrowind, which they now occupy, and it's known that patrols of Argonians are still out in force, looking for dunmer stragglers. The districts of House Dress would have been the first areas the Argonians laid siege to, as it is the region closest to the Blackmarsh border, and I'm sure the Argonians would have loved this revenge. However, as I mentioned, the Argonians didn't just capture a small zone just over the border, they went all the way up to Mournhold, sacking it and even assaulted land to the east, destroying the last remaining stronghold of House Telvanni in the area. Morrowind's great House Redoran were the ones who came to the rescue, and they quickly became the leading power in what remained of Morrowind. House Hlalu had been removed from the Grand Council, and Redoran capitalized on the opportunity, more or less taking the position that House Hlalu had held for centuries prior. The capital city of Morrowind was subsequently changed from Mournhold to Blacklight. So yes, that's right, after the Dunmer faced one crisis after another, the Argonians still couldn't take all of their land thanks to House Redoran. However, while Redoran were able to drive the Argonians away, halting their progress from extending further into the north and west areas of the province, the Argonians still did a lot of damage to the east and south, and at least temporarily, they got a lot further than you might have expected. We can learn of this in the Elder Scrolls novel by Gregory Keyes named The Infernal City. The book is considered canon, and within its pages we learn of an area named the Scathing Bay, which was created during the Red Year, which simply refers to the year involving the fall of Bar Dao from the sky, which crashed into Vivec City, causing the eruption of Red Mountain. So the area once called Vivec City was reduced to nothing, an island of shattered stone and ash, now home to the Scathing Bay. The large bay is filled with boiling water and takes up a significant portion of the Ascadian Isles. The air around it smells like hard minerals, and the sky above was described as practically dead. Now in the novel, it is said that when the Argonian invasion arrived in Vardenfell, Argonian warlocks actually performed rituals along the bay. Yes, you heard that correctly, the Argonians came this far, all the way to Vardenfell. While they were driven away by House Redoran and mostly hold lands to the south of Morrowind, only on the mainland, this piece of evidence shows that they reached further than you may have thought. It's safe to assume that some of these southern territories the Argonians captured from the Dark Elves were the same areas that the Dark Elves took from them in the Arnesian War, but obviously the Argonians have extended their territorial grasp even further, and their savage attacks during the invasion even further again. Apparently the Anzalil who mounted the attack have showed zero signs of doing anything since House Redoran fought them off. But anyways, now that we know a solid amount about what the Argonians did and why it's believed they did it, we have to ask the question, did the Dark Elves deserve it? Now the first thing to point out here is that you obviously can't blame the Argonians for despising the Dark Elves, and we definitely can't say that the slavery of Argonians was justified. Sure, from a cultural perspective, Dark Elves see other races as lesser than themselves, but for the sake of this video, I'm going to be explaining things from the standpoint that all races deserve basic rights, such as not being captured from your homeland and made into a slave for the benefit of another province. So it's clear the Dark Elves are in the wrong here, but that's not really the focus. The focus is going to be if how the Argonians responded actually was a way of delivering true justice. I'm not too convinced, and here's an analogy to explain my thoughts, which I'll shortly get into, explaining more lore which makes me think the Argonians were just as bad. So, if a pickpocket steals a bunch of money from you, then that pickpocket has done the wrong thing. If that pickpocket went to escape with your money, but then you snatched it back from him, then that would be fair enough. Even if you then proceeded to have him get into legal trouble for attempting attempting to steal, that would also be fair, for he was the one who committed a crime and is the only person being punished by it. However, if a pickpocket stole from you and escaped with your money, and then you proceeded to steal that money back from someone else entirely, someone who has never stolen from you or anyone, then that obviously wouldn't be fair. It would make you just as bad as the criminal. If the pickpocket escaped with your money, but you found out who his family was and killed them to get back at him, then that would be even worse, for your actions are more severe than his, and you've affected innocent people. The main point here is that two wrongs don't make a right, so while the Dark Elves did something awful, so did the Argonians, and both of the parties affected were largely innocent. But why would the Dark Elves be mostly innocent? Well, I'll tell you why soon. So when we look at what the Argonians did, it's kind of like a genocide really. It's year 6 of the 4th era, and the Argonians invade another province with the intention of wiping out everything in their way. They killed thousands and thousands of dunmer, heading all the way through most of the southern region of Morrowind, which they now occupy, and according to the novel The Infernal City, the Dark Elves found their way to Vvardenfell at one point, as I mentioned. This is a serious amount of slaughter. When we speak to Adril Arano on Solstheim, he says, "They cut a bloody swath across most of the southern region of Morrowind. Nobody seems certain why it happened. An attempt at expansion, revenge for the enslavement of their people, or perhaps both. Whatever the case may be, thousands of dunmer needlessly lost their lives, and many more were exiled from their homeland. So not only did thousands upon thousands of dunmer die, I mean really think of how many dunmer would have been living in the vast territory the Argonians ravaged, but many more had to flee to places such as Skyrim, putting unexpected pressures on the societies of other lands. Now don't get me wrong, if I were the Argonians, I'd be mad at the Dark Elves too, but if they wanted proper justice, even in the form of revenge, why not send top-tier assassins after the slave masters and the politicians supporting the problem? Well, that's absolutely not what happened. The dunmer who died would have been largely innocent. Sure, the territory to the south is operated by House Dress, who are proponents of slavery, but that doesn't mean every dunmer is to blame. You see, the majority of dunmer wouldn't be running around enslaving people or even owning slaves at all. Owning a slave would be far too expensive for the common Dark Elf, who has very little in the way of wealth and lives off cheap food they buy at the markets. Sure, in some cases, slaves may have been the ones that worked the plantations to produce the food, but what else are the majority of the population to do? Not buy food? Plenty would produce food sources for themselves too, surely. Most citizens are not rich, and slaves were owned by the rich. It's the kind of situation where you would find one Telvanni wizard with 15 slaves, but then hundreds of poor Dark Elf laborers who don't own any slaves at all because they're poor. Simply put, think about it mathematically. If every Dark Elf owned just one slave, then 50% of the population of Morrowind would be slaves. That is 50% non-dunmer. This is obviously absurd and is miles away from the reality of the situation. I think using statistics from the Elder Scrolls 3 Morrowind would be helpful here. So there's about 2,675 NPCs in the entire game, and about 170 are slaves. This means that about 6% of the population on Vvardenfell were slaves. With an even distribution, this would mean that only 3 out of 50 Dark Elves would even own one single slave each. This is a tiny fraction, and to slaughter the other 47 theoretical Dark Elves in the name of revenge against slavery would be totally unfair. However, what's even more unfair is that even saying that 3 out of every 50 Dark Elves own a slave would be a very skewed stat. This is because of what I said about the distribution of wealth. The rich owned slaves. You would never have 3 single people out of 50 owning just one slave each. You're much more likely to find one person in 100 owning 6 slaves all to themselves, or even one person in 300 owning 18 slaves who run the plantation which they make large profits from. If you want an example from our own history, we can take a look at Rome. Here it was estimated that roughly 49% of all slaves were owned by an elite class who made up less than 1.5% of the Empire's population. But back to the Elder Scrolls universe, let's just say that because House Dress has a higher prevalence of slavery, we triple the occurrence of slaves. There's a good chance that this is a solid overestimate, but even if that's the case, you would still have the population being about 18% slaves, which to me sounds silly, but let's just use it anyway. This means that 9 out of every 50 people would own one slave each, which again, as we know, is not how things work. You would see one rich person out of 100 Dark Elves owning 18 slaves on a plantation, but the other 99 Dark Elves owning 0. What's more to consider is that not all slaves were Argonians either. Many were actually Khajiit, for example. So when you realize that the Argonians invaded such a huge territory of Morrowind and went on a genocidal slaughter, annihilating thousands and thousands of Dark Elves, women and children, whoever, only of which a very small minority were involved with slavery, then it doesn't sound too righteous, does it? Sure, other Dark Elves who didn't own slaves themselves still might be involved in capturing them, but those specific individuals wouldn't make up a large part of the population either. To me, what the Argonians did sounds just as bad, if not worse, than capturing slaves from the border of the province. One counterpoint could be the idea that large portions of uninvolved Dark Elves probably still supported slavery mentally, but I don't think killing them all for the thoughts they keep in their head is right. Another mitigating factor would be that what the Argonians didn't stretch on for centuries like the slavery did, but even still, the reality is this. The Argonians attacked plenty of Dark Elves who had nothing to do with it. It wasn't just House Dress either. They eventually clashed with other great houses such as House Redoran, who are known to have much lower levels of slave usage. With the Argonians invading the southern parts of Morrowind, they also would have slaughtered through the territory in and around the city of Narcissus. This was in the district of House Hlalu, who, like House Redoran, used slavery far less frequently. Another thing to note is that not all Dark Elves even agree with slavery. There's some that join special faction groups that outright oppose the slavery of Argonians, and one of these groups can be found in Elder Scrolls III Morrowind. The people in it were part of what was called the Twin Lamps, and I bring this group up because I'm sure the Argonians would have indiscriminately killed plenty of abolitionists in their invasion too. Now, is there anything else to consider which would paint the Argonians in an even more unfriendly light? Well, besides wronging many innocent people who had never wronged them, there are other things which make it worse. One glaringly obvious factor is that the Dunmer were already suffering from two crises that happened in a really short period of time. The Oblivion crisis happened, and then Red Mountain exploded. The lands of Morrowind would already never be the same, and the Dark Elves were getting seriously messed up in all kinds of ways, fleeing the province or dying from effects caused by the eruption. Perhaps you'd think that the Argonian invaders would see this as karma, but instead they decided that it was the perfect time to strike. I mean, again, I really do agree with their feelings of wanting to wipe out those who hurt them, but they really just decided to harm the good alongside the bad, killing a whole bunch of already suffering elves who did nothing wrong. It just seems hateful to me, and even more so when you take into account even more factors, such as the outlawing of slavery in Morrowind. So the Oblivion crisis happens in the year 433 of the Third Era. This is the final year of the Third Era. Now, by this time, it was well known in Cyrodiil that King Helseth of Morrowind had abolished slavery, making it illegal. We can hear citizens talking about it in Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion, after all. So slavery is abolished. Argonians dominate their own fight against the Daedra, but the Dark Elves get damaged by the crisis. Then Red Mountain explodes and the Dark Elves get even more destroyed. All the while, the Dark Elves have outlawed slavery, and so their relationship with the Argonians would by all means have been improving, even if only slowly. So imagine if you're an Argonian, and you hate the fact that the elite of Morrowind have owned slaves of your people for a very long time. You then hear that the king of these Dark Elves actually makes an effort to stop the slavery, viewing it himself as immoral and banning it. Years go by after this, and you then hear that they've been smashed by multiple mass-scale problems, surely at this point deciding to create another mass-scale crisis for them by invading their province and slaughtering anyone and everyone you can would feel just a little over the top, right? Like you're punishing 100% of the Dark Elf demographic who are really hurt right now for the actions of quite a small minority, and at that, years after this minority has had their slavery banned. Sure, the slavery would probably still exist on the sly, but if I was an Argonian, I would be celebrating at home, not invading another province in the name of revenge, killing buckets of Dunmer citizens who never did anything for me to avenge in the first place. So in summary, did the Dark Elves deserve it? I'd say no, not really, but neither did the many Argonians who got kidnapped, obviously. I think on a macro provincial scale, we can broadly say that the Argonians took an eye for an eye, and we could also take a note from Fallout and say, war never changes. Obviously, there's going to be innocent casualties in most conflicts, but as you can see, when we zoom in and take all the little details into account, this isn't just a normal conflict. On one side, we've got the capturing of innocent Argonians to be forcibly used as an economic tool, and on the other side, we've got a mass-scale invasion to do as much damage to Dark Elves, mostly innocent ones, as possible. Like I said in the beginning of the video, I want to hear your thoughts on this video in the comments section, as I always love to look at different Elder Scrolls events from new angles. As always, thank you all so much for watching the video the whole way through. Elder Scrolls lore involving viewpoints of various societies is really interesting to me, and I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Social media links are in the description. My name's Michael, and I look forward to nerding out with you again very soon.